Political analyst, and I'm joined by two experts on the election cycle, my colleague Donna King, who is editor-in-chief of Carolina Journal, and Donald Bryson, who is president and chief strategy officer at the John Locke Foundation. Both of you have been following the elections very closely, so I think among the three of us, we'll probably cover all of the important bases.
Sure.
Let's go ahead and start with the marquee matchup from the North Carolina elections. Open U.S. Senate seat, Richard Burr retiring, so that was a Republican in that role. For Republicans, it was up to Ted Budd, the congressman, to help them hold it, or for Democrats, up to former State Supreme Court Chief Justice Sherry Beasley to win it and put it in the Democrats' column. Budd ends up winning. What did you think was the most significant thing about this race? Let's start with Donald.
I think the most significant thing about this race was that the National Democratic establishment just refused to invest in this race. I think that was something that you heard the North Carolina Democratic Party and the Beasley campaign complain about over and over again. And they made a big bet early on in the summer of spending a lot of her campaign money to show that she was a viable candidate. This was a winnable race. And they just didn't invest here. They poured a lot of money into races they probably weren't going to win, and races they ended up winning. But they poured a lot of money into Florida and some other states, and that just wasn't going to happen very clearly. And so that was remarkable to me in that North Carolina's pretty purpley. I think it's purple trending red, depending on what part of the state you're talking about. But with some sort of investment early on, maybe even in the late summer by national groups, this could have been a winnable race for Democrats, and they just didn't.
Yeah, I think that is actually the big point of it. This was neck and neck. It was so close coming through the summer, that even closer than I expected it to be. But in the end, I think Beasley ended up with like $22 million in independent expenditures. Budd had somewhere in the 60s. So there really wasn't that big amount of Democrat spending coming in for Beasley. But in the end, she really focused her message on first abortion access, and then in the last few days, that threat to democracy narrative that we were hearing a lot about. Budd stuck with his process of talking about inflation, crime, doing a 100-county tour. He really stuck to his messaging, and so did she. And she tried to tap into not a Biden administration connection, but a Roy Cooper connection. She appeared on the night before Election Day with Governor Cooper on stage. She really tied herself to him, not the Biden administration, and Budd really took his message out to all 100 counties.
A couple of other important points to note about this race. I'm going to toss it back to Donald because you are the expert on this front. The Civitas poll,
right,
which has been looking at this race throughout the course of the year, the final Civitas poll in the Budd-Beasley race basically ended up being almost spot on.
It was spot on. Our poll went into the field October 20th through 22nd, so those first 3 days of early voting, or in-person early voting. We have absentee by mail, and we have no excuse absentee voting in North Carolina, so it's all just early voting, right? Yeah. But the first 3 days of early voting, our poll was in the field. It came back, had Budd with a 3.8% lead. It turns out that the margin on a victory was 3.63%, which means that we called the margin within 0.17, less than 0.2%. We're really happy with that. It shows, that we try and strive and have a good partnership with Signal to have accurate polling in North Carolina, and that was pretty spot on. After our poll came out, as it does with every major election, there were a flood of polls in those last 2 weeks, even 10 days, that were showing more of a surge for Ted Budd. But I think that's something we saw nationally, that generally speaking, polling was very accurate this cycle. None of the problems that we saw in 2016. But there was just this weird surge of more GOP-friendly polls there right at the end that just didn't live up to their billing. The Trafalgar group was one group and just missed, it didn't miss a lot, but did miss some on several national polls, including the margin of error within this race.
Go ahead, Don.
Oh, I was going to say, I think what we're also seeing is, with Budd pulling ahead, he may have pulled with him some General Assembly candidates across the state because turnout was actually pretty high. Democrats were really pounding the pavement to get their vote out and go door to door, get people to show up at the polls. They probably didn't have the turnout that they were hoping to. Chatham County, I think, had the highest turnout, around 65%. And Pitt County had the lowest, and they Democrats held on to, I think, all but one seat. Is that right, or the other way around? But I think in general, I think turnout was high for a midterm. But nobody really broke that 65% mark. So that's something they're really going to be focused on in 24.
One other thing to note about this race before we move on to the U.S. House races is Democrats and their ideological allies spent a lot of time early on in this campaign trying to keep the Green Party off the ballot. Doesn't seem like that ended up playing much of a difference. The gap between Bud and Beasley, about what we saw for other statewide races, and the Greens, while they did get some votes, certainly didn't cost Sherry Beasley this election.
No, I don't think so.
No, they definitely didn't do that.
Or the Libertarians.
Or Libertarians with the Republican vote. You didn't see that. I was a little surprised. Usually you see sort of those third parties do a little bit better in North Carolina. Certainly if you think back to some of the gubernatorial elections, say, and presidential elections in 2008, 2012, 2016, third party candidates, particularly Libertarians, do really well in North Carolina. But I don't think that either of them broke 2% this time. Which is, 5% is the threshold, right, to continue to be a viable party within the state and continue to appear on the ballot without having to go through the whole petition process. And so I'm seeing those third parties trend down. And of course, the Constitution Party couldn't even get on the ballot this year.
Yeah. So that was North Carolina's U.S. Senate race, the big marquee matchup. We also had all of our now 14 seats in the U.S. House of Representatives were up for grabs, and brand new maps. We were guaranteed to have brand new maps anyway because of a census, but we ended up on the third iteration of the maps as they were drawn. There was a map drawn by the General Assembly. That one got thrown out by the courts. Another map drawn by the General Assembly. That one got thrown out by the courts, and we ended up with a map that was drawn by some special masters for a 3-judge trial panel, and perhaps was not even drawn by the special masters themselves, but by some consultants working for special masters. In a race where you had about a 5-point margin for Republicans on the generic ballot of 53, 47, 52, 48, somewhere in there, statewide, we ended up with a 7-7 split between Republicans and Democrats in the congressional delegation. Donald, your thoughts about what's most significant about those races?
Well, I think it's interesting that you have Republicans win all 6 judicial races, statewide judicial races, then they win the U.S. Senate race, and yet the congressional map still ends up 7-7. It's a little bit of a head scratcher in terms of how the maps were drawn. I'll leave that speculation there. I do think that the loser here, in my opinion, in the congressional races in North Carolina was Donald Trump. I think he won, if you include the Senate race this year, he went 1-3 with Ted Budd winning. But his other 3 endorsements of Sandy Smith and Bo Hines and then Madison Cawthorn, of course, in this primary, they lost. That just didn't go well this year. Now, I don't know if there's upheaval or civil war going on within the Republican Party. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying he didn't have a good night.
And those were winnable races, certainly. The Cawthorn one, he had his own challenges, but certainly Smith and Bo Hines were in races that Republicans could have won.
Oh, absolutely.
It's not as if he endorsed someone in a far blue district.
Absolutely, and we polled the 13th, which we have up here on our screen behind us, and hopefully our folks at home can see the screen. With the 13th, we polled that with Survey USA, I think 10, 12 days before Election Day. We had Hines within a point or point and a half, and that ended up being about the margin that Nickel won by. We called it about right. Interesting, if you look into that, typically what happens in North Carolina is that Democrats lead, or Democrat votes lead in early voting by mail and in person, and then there's this sort of red surge as the night goes on as those Election Day ballots come in. But in that race, Bo Hines didn't even win the Election Day ballots. And it was just this, pouring on of ballots coming in. I'm not saying illegal ballots, but there were just so many people in southern Wake County compared to those other counties within the district that he just couldn't overcome it.
Sure. And that's the thing. If Bo Hines had pulled it out, Republicans would have had an 8-6 lead, which would probably be more along the lines of what we were talking about as opposed to a 7-7. But there in that area of Johnson County and just outside the Capitol, I think Wiley Nickel was successful in painting himself as something of a moderate. His history in the General Assembly indicates that he is not. He's much more progressive than maybe his advertising campaign showed, but I think that the people, the voters there in that area, were looking for something of a moderate. You know, it's a suburb of the capital area, and I think he was successful in his advertising and putting himself out there as a moderate. It'll be interesting to see what he does when he gets up to Capitol Hill. But again, you got to point out that these maps are likely going to be redrawn. We'll probably have a new set of them. I think Dallas Woodhouse on our live stream on election night advised those winners to rent, don't buy when you get up there, because we don't know what the maps are going to look like next time.
Yeah, certainly that when these maps were even put in place, they were advertised by the courts as being for one-time use, just this 2022 election cycle. Donald, you mentioned that both of those races, the Nickel-Hines race and also the Don Davis-Sandy Smith race, could be treated as losses for Donald Trump. And we should remind people it's because both Bo Hines and Sandy Smith won hotly contested primaries, probably because they were the Trump candidates.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. It's interesting, you know, and this was fairly typical nationally, where Donald Trump was making endorsements this year. A Donald Trump endorsement gets you somewhere between 32 to 35% of a primary. That's an awful lot in a primary, and you need to earn the other, 15, 16, 18% of it. The problem is that eats away at you on the other side, right? There are plenty of unaffiliated voters. There are plenty of Democrats who are motivated to just vote against Donald Trump or anybody associated with Donald Trump. And so I think that's sort of what came out. Now, the Madison Cawthorn thing, he sort of had his own problems. There was a lot of problems, I think, with the Sandy Smith thing. She really leaned into the frying pan. Literally, I mean, we campaigned with a frying pan after some allegations about domestic violence in some marriages. I don't know if that was a good tactic or not. May have been. I don't know.
They love her up there.
It was funny.
Yeah,
I'll say that.
It was interesting.
But overall, nationally speaking, the question is the Trump effect cooling off? I don't know if this is a sign of that or not, but it may be. I'll say the national poll that just came out, National Review did a study of it, or did a release of it over the weekend. More than half of Republicans prefer someone else to run rather than Donald Trump for president in 2024.
We really haven't talked about the other races, but the incumbents all won, and none of them really had a major problem. As we're speaking, Republicans nationally have not crossed the 218 point to win control of the House, but I think that people are still expecting that at some point they will, maybe just barely. We should probably talk a little bit about what that means for North Carolina's U.S. House delegation. If, in fact, Republicans do take a majority, we have some people who've been in the minority in that caucus who now may take on some pretty important positions.
Absolutely. I think Patrick McHenry, of course, is one of them. Virginia Fox will probably return to a leadership role in education. And then Richard Hudson, of course, has been really active in veterans services and those committees. So I think we're going to see North Carolina's delegation really rise to a level of leadership and authority that perhaps they wouldn't have otherwise had, because now the Republicans in our delegation really have some experience. And Kathy Manning in District 6, she won, but it was a tightly contested race. So they may be really focused on trying to regroup for the next go-round.
They may be, but yes, North Carolina's congressional profile will really be elevated. You mentioned McHenry and Fox and Hudson. Remember, David Rouser came in as a freshman back in, 2012, 2014, and it was unheard of that a freshman was chairing a subcommittee on agriculture, but he did. He's very likely to be back in some sort of leadership position, a vice chair of agriculture or a committee sub-chair again. And so we're a really important state when it comes to what will likely be, but we don't know yet, a new Republican Congress. But that's good for North Carolina in a lot of ways, but it also means a lot more campaign dollars will be flowing through North Carolina in 2 more years.
We also are likely to see, if Republicans do end up winning the U.S. House, a lot more perhaps deadlock because it looks as if the Democrats are going to keep control of the U.S. Senate. I think last I saw that they had secured a 50th seat, which is enough for them with the vice president casting a tie-breaking vote to continue to control the U.S. Senate. So we may see more gridlock on Capitol Hill. What a shock.
We may see more gridlock. I think a lot of people, the public generally speaking, are upset when Congress isn't doing something. But from a small government mindset, gridlock is great. It means they're not passing laws, right? They're not passing more regulations. They're not passing more taxes. And so I think gridlock is good. If you look back at the size of the federal government, it grows when one party is in all power, right? The growth really slows when there is gridlock. And so I think there are a lot of Republicans, probably a lot of our viewers, that were disappointed nationally, and I still am scratching my head with what happened nationally. I felt like we were really comfortable we knew this was going to happen in North Carolina, but nationally speaking, I don't know what happened. Anyway, as a conservative or a fiscal conservative, we should be happy that there will be gridlock.
Gridlock tends to be good. All right, unless we need to say something else about the national front, let's go ahead and move on.
I'm just looking forward to see what Senator-elect Ted Budd does once he gets there. You know, as a member of Congress, he was in the House. He was, I think, pretty active and made some interesting, strive to really make a difference as a congressional representative. As a senator, I think he's probably going to follow a lot of what Senator Tillis has laid out. And I think he will probably emerge as a leader in that freshman class because he's been pretty active and had a national presence.
And that's a good reminder that in some other states, the Trump-endorsed candidate getting through to the general election was often then painted as far outside the mainstream, extreme in some ways. That didn't stick to Ted Budd. People looked at Ted Budd and said, yes, he's conservative, but he's well within the mainstream. He hasn't done anything that's super crazy.
He had a congressional record that people could look at, and I thought the Budd campaign balanced that out pretty well, actually. They got all of the gain of the Trump endorsement and none of the pain, really, of it. And so good on them. I don't know how they did it, but they did it.
That focus on 100-county tour.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's a lot of it is, don't put your eggs all in the urban basket because you may not get any traction there. So they focused heavily on visiting suburban and rural areas. And I think he really got a lot of traction that way. Don't get as much media coverage that way because nowadays it feels like everybody just sticks close to their newsrooms. But he got a lot of traction.
Which is different from what you saw in Pennsylvania where, Dr. Oz was viewed as sort of this New Jersey carpetbagger coming into Pennsylvania. Not helped by, some of his ads saying, take a break just before the Steelers game and vote. Well, the Steelers had a bye, right? Any good Steelers fan would know that the Steelers had a bye that week.
Yes. And I guess it also bears repeating that one of the things that could end up being a downside because of the successful Budd campaign is that future candidates may say, well, why should I take part in any debates?
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. Right.
We saw Ted Budd avoid all primary debates, and they had the one debate with Sherry Beasley on a Friday night when no one was really paying attention.
That's true.
So the future of debates after this success for the Budd campaign may be in question.
That's true. If Club for Growth is going to come in and dump $14 million for someone in a primary, right? If you don't have that, then you do have to get your views sort of spread out among the primary voters some way or another, because, I mean, if we didn't know anything, if we never saw any of these candidates before, what do we think is the qualitative difference between Pat McCrory and Ted Budd and Marjorie Eastman? We don't really, and Mark Walker, we don't really know, right? Fortunately for Ted Budd, there was, $12 to $14 million of advertisements coming in to talk about his record, and that really worked out for him.
Yep, certainly did. Well, let's go ahead and switch gears now to the state level, where the main thing that people were focusing on was Republicans are going to control the General Assembly. I think everyone, maybe even the Democratic strategists, would admit that, yes, Republicans are going to win control. But are they going to get the veto-proof supermajorities? Are they going to have enough votes that sticking together by themselves, they could overcome a veto from Governor Roy Cooper? And we saw that on the Senate side, that did happen. Republicans picked up 2 seats. Now we'll hold 30 seats in the state Senate, which is just on that threshold of a 3/5 majority to override a veto. On the House side, It looks as if, and I'm going to say it looks as if, because there are a couple of races where the apparent loser has not yet conceded, one of them a Democrat, one a Republican, but it looks as if the Republicans came up one vote short of supermajority, 71 seats when they needed 72. Donna, let's start with you this time. Your thoughts on how things came out with the legislative
Sure.
elections.
I actually think Republicans did better than I expected. We had been talking all summer that they would hold the majority, maybe not get a supermajority, but probably continue down the path of the policy focus that they've had, which would be to keep taxes down, government regulation down, make sure we had rainy day funds for recessions and pandemics and whatever was coming. So we saw that policy likely continuing those priorities. But then I think I was actually surprised at how well they came out with the Senate having a supermajority, one vote shy in the House potentially. But imagine the pressure that's going to be on that Democrat caucus. I mean, every single one of them has to show up for a vote. There's going to be a lot of horse trading, I think, when it comes to budget time for some of the Democrat members who perhaps have some needs for their district and want to be able to support the budget even if Governor Cooper vetoes it again. So it'll be interesting to see the inner workings, the dynamics of that process as they try to override potential vetoes. The big thing that I noticed was the back and forth, back to the drawing board of the maps. One of the things that happened, there were 4 key districts that were considered up for grabs, and Republicans swept all of them. So I think when that happened, we started really saying, okay, this is looking good for Republicans in the state legislature and is for state legislatures across the country. Democrats did pretty well in governor's races on Tuesday. Republicans did really well in state legislatures. So there is sort of this wisdom, I think, among voters that they like the idea of a conservative legislature, even if they like the idea of a Democrat governor. So, North Carolina is not that different in that way, but I think it was an interesting result from this midterm.
Yeah, no, I think that, Donna hit it right on the head. That's why we pay her the big bucks. She's really smart. But it will be interesting to see what happens in the state house, assuming Republicans are at 71 seats, and they probably are, but we'll see. Some people, we have some election deniers, wink, wink, but we'll see how that works out there. I was joking with someone, it'll be interesting to see how many local community parks get funded in the budget next time around to get some Democrat votes in the budget, or some sort of pork. We'll have to be on pork watch on that, because that's honestly how you get votes to come along across party lines in a lot of ways. I think this is an overall good result for Republicans because they still sort of
had net gains.
They had net gains, and they still get to sort of hand check the governor overall. This in addition to the gains that they made in the state courts. So I would look for at least the state Senate. We'll see what the House does, but I would imagine the state Senate is probably going to come out with a fairly aggressive conservative agenda coming out next year. It'll be interesting to see what and if Senator Phil Berger, who's the Republican leader of the Senate, says going forward in the next couple of months.
Do you think, either one of you, that the fact that they did not reach supermajorities in both chambers changes anything about their approach to the session? I mean, my guess is perhaps it's a little bit more of a conservative agenda, but it might be a lot like it's been over the last 4 years.
Sure.
You do what you want moving forward, try to get as many Democratic votes as you can, but know that there are some things that you probably just aren't going to get, because you're not going to get legislation passed that is clearly only Republican supported.
Right. I think that's likely, but I also think that the first indicator that probably is true was the decision not to have the December session. So they were going to come back and have a session in December, get the ball rolling for January, but they announced last week, Senate Leader Phil Berger and Speaker Tim Moore said, okay, look, we're not going to do this December thing like we planned. We're going to start session in January because we really have to get all these new members in, get a chance to talk to them, see where they stand, how they want to represent their communities, and then start really working on their agenda. So I agree. I think normally I would say, okay, they're going to just keep right on moving, but they've got some new faces in the crowd, and I think they really want to figure out where they stand.
I think it does change the decision calculus on the issue of abortion. I think a lot of people were anticipating, I was hearing rumors of 74, 76 seats in the House. I always thought 76 was a bit much. 74, I was like, man, that's going to be a really good night for Republicans. If they had outright, I think the spin term we're hearing now is a functional supermajority in the state House. But if they had had outright supermajorities in both the House and the Senate, I think you would see a much more aggressive pro-life agenda. But because you can send it to the governor will veto it and come back, and you have the supermajorities. But now you're going to have something that is palatable enough for 2 or 3 Democrats to come along with, assuming every Republican's present and every Republican is healthy. That's really hard to do. And so I would imagine that part of sort of a social conservative agenda is probably going to slow down. I don't know what they're going to do, but I doubt it's going to be as aggressive as they were hoping for.
Yeah, I think you're right on track with the idea that if they had had supermajorities, they probably would have felt an obligation to put forward an abortion bill because a substantial chunk of the Republican base is the pro-life movement. And they would say, look, you've got veto-proof supermajorities. Abortion has been in the cards and talked about,
right,
and it's in the state's hand because of the Dobbs decision.
Right.
You got to do something. Now, perhaps they take a little bit more measured stance, and maybe there is an abortion bill. But as Donald suggested, it's got to be something that would get at least 1 or 2 Democratic votes in the House,
right,
or why do it?
Right.
Sure. I think we're going to see again voter ID might pop back up because if for some if we find that that the voter ID idea is rejected completely or it doesn't come back in some form, I think we will probably see a piece of legislation maybe coming forward through it. I think we'll also probably see the Parents' Bill of Rights bubble up in some form because we saw a relative wave, if not a little bit of a tide pool there in our state board of elections. In our school boards across the state. Republicans got some traction, particularly in New Hanover County. So the outcry among parents after the government closures of public schools, I think you're going to see more of that effort to give parents a voice in public education.
Yeah, very interesting stuff. Donald, any more thoughts about what you think the General Assembly is going to be up to?
I'm going to be watching and be very interested to see the pressure that is put on pro-school choice Democrats in the coming legislative session. I think that there is still a lot of fallout from the COVID shutdowns and learning loss that came from that. And believe it or not, voucher is not a dirty word down on Jones Street anymore. You can say it. You can talk about charter schools, and it's okay. You can talk about opportunity scholarships, and it's okay to talk about down there. And so I think that with the idea of learning loss, people need some more options to figure out how to catch kids back up. The NAEP scores were awful, not just for North Carolina, but nationally, but all generally for the same reason. And so just be watching to see if there's sort of this guerrilla lobbying campaign to get some sort of education savings accounts going for learning loss or something like that, and bring some Democrats along with it.
Sure.
Let's switch gears now to another piece of the ballot, which often doesn't get a lot of attention, but it's incredibly important. And that is the judicial races. You've already advanced to one of the state Supreme Court races. 2 seats on the ballot this time around. Coming up before the election, you have a 7-member court. They're all elected. They are elected now since 2018 on a party label basis. We have 4 Democrats, 3 Republicans now. 2 seats up for grabs, both of them held by Democrats, and Republicans win both of them. So starting in January, we're going to have a court that has 5 Republicans, 2 Democrats. This is a really big deal.
It is.
It's a very big deal. Now, one thing that I think fell under the radar through all this is North Carolina has it in law that once a judge reaches 72 or 72 years of age, they have to retire and can no longer retain office. So Chief Justice Paul Newby will turn 72 in 2027. Both seats that were up for election this year were held by Democrats, and so the way the math worked out, if Republicans won one of those seats, they were guaranteed a majority through 2027 when Justice Newby will have to retire. If they won both, they were guaranteed through 2028, and of course we'll go through 2 more Supreme Court elections by then. Who knows what's going to happen, but this gave Republicans, winning both those seats, gave Republicans an extra year of longevity that they wouldn't have had otherwise on the state Supreme Court in a majority.
Sure. Justice Morgan, who is a Democrat, he will be the next up, I believe, in 2024. And then Justice Anita Earls will be up in 2026, I believe. So even if Democrats hold on to those seats, they're still going to have a majority through 2028. Republicans will. And I think that that's not just affecting the judicial branch, but it's something that lawmakers, we were just talking about the majority Republicans in the General Assembly, they've got to be thinking about that too, because they spent the last 6 years or so taking their legislation through the gauntlet of the court system because groups who didn't like the policy chased it down through the courts, so they were having to defend the constitutionality of their policy decisions rather than operating under okay, if we can find something that is unconstitutional, we'll track it down. But for the most part, everything was being legislated through the courts.
Yeah, of course, and that's good news for all those liberal budget hawks over at Policy Watch who are so concerned about how much money the Republican legislators have been spending on attorneys' fees. There's just no reason to do it anymore, right? So those 2 times a year that Rob Schofield cares about fiscal discipline will be eased at this point. That's good.
Now, I haven't mentioned the results, but we'll go ahead and go back now.
Sure.
Sam J. Ervin IV, Democrat seeking his 2nd term in office, gets defeated by Trey Allen, who has been working with the Administrative Office of the Courts as general counsel, also a professor at UNC Chapel Hill. And in the other race, going back to the whole thing about the mandatory retirement age, Justice Robin Hudson didn't even run because she would have only been able to serve about a year of a new term. No reason for her to spend all this time and energy to run for 1 year in office. So she didn't run. An open race between Richard Dietz and Lucy Inman, both of them Court of Appeals judges. Dietz beats Inman. Interesting discussion about both of these races. Lucy Inman ran a campaign with a lot of ads talking about her being a centrist. She was up on the air quite a bit, was really working hard at it. We saw Justice Ervin start his on-air campaign later, and it seemed as if he had fewer ads, but both of these races came out about exactly the same.
Exact numbers.
Yeah, I mean, the numbers were very close. And if you look at the Court of Appeals races, just under these, 4 seats on the Court of Appeals, 2 seats held by Democrats, 2 seats held by Republicans. Republicans won them all. Once again, very similar percentages. What does that tell you about the way people are approaching these court races? Is it all party label?
I think party label has an awful lot to do with it. And, we've been urging people, Carolina Journal and the John Locke Foundation have been urging people to, complete your ballot. Don't just vote for U.S. Senate, vote for the judges, vote for state legislature, vote for district attorney, whatever. Just, engage civically at all levels of government. And while we think we did a lot of really good work in rural North Carolina, we, in a nonpartisan way, of course, but I think the one thing that had brought more people back to voting in judicial races was putting on the partisan labels. You don't know everything about Trey Allen. I don't know everything about Trey Allen, but it gives people a general idea of what somebody believes if there is a partisan label on there. And so in that way, I think that's been really good for North Carolina, but that was what happened. Lucy Inman has been praised by everybody on both parties for running a very measured, a very disciplined campaign, great messaging, good TV ad with the hats ad. We wear a lot of hats. We shouldn't wear these hats. Had the Biden and MAGA hat. And then she still lost, right, by the same margin as everyone else. And so I think that partisanship played an awful lot. There was partisan backlash. There was Biden backlash in this, and it went well down the ballot.
Absolutely. I think the interesting part was, of course, we're talking about Lucy Inman. She was a prolific fundraiser. Nationally, Democrats poured a ton of money into these 2 races, outraising the Republicans 5-1 in some cases. But you're right, the number still came down to exactly the same in each race. So the question is, does the fundraising really matter? Does the messaging really matter? It really does seem to come down to that North Carolina voters were alarmed by what they were hearing from in judicial activism, regardless of whether they knew anything specifically about the candidates or knew anything about the cases. This judicial activism, argument that's been floating around for the last 6 months or so, I think resonated with voters, and it scared them and alarmed them. And the push to make sure you finish your ballot, having the D's and R's on the ballot makes a big difference, because when all else fails, they at least know that much. And I think that pulled them along with, when you combine it with the Bud campaign and the state legislature.
One thing that Justice Ervin, and people have always talked about, he's been able to rely upon his name. Of course, his father was the late U.S. Senator, famous for I've lost the word.
Watergate.
Watergate. I was going to say Whitewater, but that's not
Actually,
right.
his
That's all right.
grandfather.
Yeah, the Watergate
grandfather,
case. That's right.
Grandfather, his
His
father
grandfather,
was,
I'm sorry,
and his
you're
father
right.
was a federal judge.
And his father was, but it's a well-known political
Yes,
name in
sure.
North Carolina, and people always talk about how you can rely on that Irvin name, and I don't think that's been true for a few years now, and I think that this year really showed that it was true. That people just don't know who the Irvins are in North Carolina political history anymore. Remember, we've had a large influx of people in this state. More than 50% of the people in this state weren't born in this state, including me and you. I don't know about you. I don't know where you were born.
Got here about kindergarten, so.
Okay, got here about kindergarten. So,
Guam.
Yeah.
okay.
I was.
So, this long, sort of history, political history in North Carolina just doesn't play out
Sure.
the way that it has traditionally anymore. In addition to that, there's a little bit of gamesmanship afoot. This race that we were talking about with, if I can get it back, between Lucy Inman and Richard Dietz, both of them are sitting appellate court judges, which means that now that there is an open seat, and that will be Richard Dietz's seat, Governor Cooper is going to have the power to appoint a replacement. What do you think is going to happen, Mitch?
Well, it's entirely possible that he might put Lucy Inman back on there, or he could put Darren Jackson on, because Darren Jackson, Governor Cooper had appointed him to the position. Jackson was up for election, as he had to be after an appointment, lost his election, but perhaps Governor Cooper puts him back on. I'm glad that you noted that, because we had 4 seats on the Court of Appeals. 2 of them were held by Democrats, 2 held by Republicans. Republicans swept, so you'd think, oh, well, they're going to get a net gain of 2 seats. Well, they're actually going to end up with a net gain of 1 seat, because Richard Dietz, leaving the court with 2 years left in his term to go to the Supreme Court, will give Governor Cooper a chance to fill that seat. So instead of having the 12-3 majority on the Court of Appeals that you might have expected, it'll actually be 11-4, a net gain of 1. And for those who don't follow the Court of Appeals, they sit in 3-judge panels, and the panels have to work as often as possible with other people. So sometimes, even though there will only be 4 Democrats in there, there occasionally will be a 3 Democrat judge panel, because they're all supposed to work with each other and about as often as they do with the others.
Sure,
That'll
sure.
be very.
So one of the interesting things you mentioned about the Irvin name not being as familiar. So there are a lot of new people in North Carolina, but I also think this might have been an election where whoever has that sort of political pedigree, regardless of which side they're on, maybe we're disadvantaged by that. I think people were tired of the same old families running things, particularly in the judiciary. So Sam Irvin may have been harmed by that. Lucy Inman is from the Daniels family, the founders of the News and Observer, and Josephus Daniels going back. So that may have been a downside for them, particularly in areas where people knew of their families for years and years. And a newcomer in a Republican, in Trey Allen and Richard Dietz, it seemed like a relative newcomer, although both of them have been around the judiciary for quite some time, that may have appealed to some voters.
Before we go away from the judicial elections and then talk about what else of interest we should know about, there's a chance now that some of these rulings that have come out recently from the state Supreme Court that have been party line votes could get revisited in some respects. I'm thinking particularly of redistricting, because we know there are going to be new election maps next year, almost certainly for Congress, and maybe even for State House and Senate. It kind of depends on what this current court says. That's a chance for the new state Supreme Court to step in and say something about redistricting and whether our Constitution really does say something about partisan gerrymandering or not. Also, Leandro. We just saw a ruling, party line vote from the state Supreme Court, 4-3, with the Democrats ruling that a trial judge could overrule both the legislative and executive branches and say, no, you have to spend this much more on education. And then B, not only that, but we're going to bypass the General Assembly and say that the judge can order state executive branch officials to move the money. That's something that really could come back before the state Supreme Court. What do you think the likelihood of that is?
That seems so alarming to me, that we could have a ruling that judges and a court, 7 people could decide what our policy priorities are for North Carolina. You're actually the expert in a lot of how this works. How would that work? if Leandra's decision has already been released by the Supreme Court justices on this Democrat-leaning panel, how could this come back to a panel that once it switches over in January?
Well, there are a couple of ways. One could just be the way that the case plays out. I mean, right now, what the Supreme Court has ordered is that Leandro, which is officially called Hoke County Board of Education versus State, but it's known as Leandro because a guy who is now a partner in one of the major Raleigh law firms was a student in Hoke County, or I believe in Hoke County, years ago, back when this case started. The case goes back to a trial judge.
Okay.
What the Supreme Court has ordered the trial judge to do is first determine how much money needs to be spent to comply with this remedial plan developed to deal with Leandro. It shouldn't be more than $785 million because that's what he ordered the last time. And the thought is that the most recently enacted state budget probably includes at least some money for that, for the purposes of Leandro, and so you could slice that off the $785 million. But then the second part of the Supreme Court order is once you determine the money, then order the state budget director, state controller, state treasurer to move the money. So the case goes back to Judge Michael Robinson. He could decide, I mean, he's going to decide whatever the number is.
Right.
And then presumably, he will order these state officials to move the money, although he has sidestepped that issue in the past, saying the Court of Appeals told me I can't do it, so I'm not going to do it. It's entirely possible, I guess, that Judge Robinson could say, well, regardless of what the Supreme Court told me, I can't order this money to be moved because it would be against the law. That is an order that could be appealed, which would get it back to the new state Supreme Court. If Judge Robinson says, no, the state Supreme Court told me I have to order this money moved, and so I'm going to order it moved, then it would be up to the state government officials who have been ordered to move the money.
Right.
One presumes that the state budget director works directly for Governor Cooper and would share his priorities. And Governor Cooper wants this money spent.
Sure.
So one suspects that the state budget director will say, yes, let's spend the money. It would then go to the state controller, who in the past, under Controller Linda Combs, she was the one who initially objected to this money transfer and took it to court. She has retired, but the acting controller, Nels Roseland, has gone along with her legal strategy. So we will have to see whether the acting controller continues to object. If he doesn't, if he says, no, the state Supreme Court has decided I've got to do this, so I've got to do this, then the ball is in the court of our state treasurer, Dale Folwell. Dale Folwell has not said to this point what he would do, but he has said on the record it's still against the law to move money out of the Treasury without an order from the General Assembly.
Right.
If Dale Folwell refuses to move the money, that's likely to be appealed and is likely to go back to the state Supreme Court. So there are many ways that this gets back to the state Supreme Court.
And we changed partisan labels there in the middle of that, and I'm sure most of our viewers know this, but just so everybody's clear, the state budget director who works directly, and is an employee, works directly for Roy Cooper, is presumably a Democrat working under a Democrat administration, and then the term for the previous state controller that you mentioned earlier had been appointed by Pat McCrory, a Republican. The new one has been appointed by a Democrat, Roy Cooper, we presume Democrat, but then State Treasurer Dale Folwell is not a Democrat. He is an independently elected position because we have a very dispersed executive branch in North Carolina, and he is in fact a Republican. And so there's a partisan tinge to this, but on traditional grounds of Republicans are sort of fiscal hawks and Democrats want to spend the monies. And so,
and the Constitution,
and what is actually in the Constitution, and so it'll be interesting to see where that process is going to break down somewhere, right? Because there's a lot of people and a lot of moving parts. It's just where is it going to break down?
Yeah, and I think you could see an appeal back to the state Supreme Court on a number of different levels, depending on who thinks they're going to get the best ruling from that state Supreme Court.
Could they ever take it outside of the state and move it through federal courts?
Almost certainly not. A lot of people have asked us, but this is a state constitutional issue and interpretations of the state constitution. Typically, if a case gets out of the state court and gets to the federal court, it's because some sort of federal constitutional right has been violated. So nothing in Leandro to date has involved any sort of claim about a federal constitutional right. And so it's unlikely that the federal courts would step into this unless someone files something that says, well, in doing this, you have now violated this federal constitutional right. All right, well, in the time that we have remaining, let's go ahead and talk a little bit about other items that were on the ballot that we should be paying attention to, because we did more than vote for Senate and House and General Assembly and judicial races. There were a lot of school board races and sheriff's races and bonds and sales tax votes. Among all of those things, let's go to Donald first. What should we pay most attention to?
Well, I'll tell you what I paid the most attention to, and if you want to interpret that as what you should pay the most attention to, then that's fine. I paid the most attention to, aside from the races that we've talked about, there were 5 counties in North Carolina with sales tax referenda on the ballot, and I think that's a remarkable part of democracy in North Carolina. It's literally an act of direct democracy, and all 5 referenda were defeated. Now, some of them were more close than in others, but you had some more urban counties like New Hanover County, suburban counties or sort of mid-sized counties like Wayne County, and then there was Macon and Cleveland and Bladen County, which were far more rural in nature. And all 5 of these were defeated. It was much more closer in New Hanover County. But Wayne County, I think, defeated theirs with 65% of the vote, rejecting the referenda. I think Macon County was 75% of the vote. I mean, those are very clearly voters in those counties voting with their pocketbooks.
Yeah, I not to cast any aspersions on the leadership in Wayne County and Macon County, but you would have thought they would have sort of assessed where things stand and plan accordingly.
Sure.
I agree.
You thought it was going to be close, yes, but 75%.
Right.
Well, it wouldn't be the first time a county commission has been a little tone deaf with what's going on, and I agree. I mean, those are 65%, 75%. That's the sort of, am I keeping my job as county commissioner next time around? But Guilford County, which is by far not a small county in North Carolina, I think they went 4 straight elections putting up a sales tax increase referendum and lost all 4 times. And it's a very consistent message from voters: no, don't do that. No, don't do that. No, don't do that. And they still came back with it.
And for folks who are concerned about the rising sales tax, one thing they should know, if they didn't already, is that these races can only be held now on big election days.
That's right.
When it first transpired that these local governments could put sales tax referendums on the ballot, they could really schedule it anytime they wanted to.
The 3rd Tuesday of July after the full moon, right? It's just...
The only people who showed up were the ones that wanted it passed.
People who wanted it passed because they knew it was on the ballot. And now, because of a change in policy and law made by the General Assembly, if you're going to put the sales tax referendum up there, fine, but it's got to be an election that a lot of people are already going to be voting.
And it's a much more transparent process.
Sure, but there were some bonds that passed. That's something to particularly in an urban area. Wake County passed, I believe, all of theirs, all of their bonds. Some of that, I think, is that tax is very clear. People know what a tax is, particularly inflation and $11 for a jar of peanut butter or whatever. People are already paying attention to that. I don't think that there's a very clear understanding of what a bond is, that eventually somebody's got to pay it back. It means your taxes are going up eventually. So, and maybe that's something that organizations who oppose bonds as generally as a funding mechanism need to think about. That public education on it is important. But I also think that a lot of these cities are looking at interest rates going through the roof, and they've got projects and plans that they've had on the books for 2 years, and they can't pay for them now because they're looking at these interest rates. But just like families, cities and governments need to readjust their plans and their financial budgeting to accommodate it. The big thing I was looking for is school boards. That's something we've talked about a lot around here, and particularly in Carolina Journal. There was what I like to call this mad mom situation going on in North Carolina after schools were shut down by the government. New Hanover County School Board had something of a wave. It's now 5-2 Republican, and that's a pretty urban area. When you look at Union County and some of these others, it was there were already more Republicans on those school boards, but a place like New Hanover County to now be majority Republican really is a sweep. Wake County added 2, and Mecklenburg County, I believe, added 2. There were a few others that saw some more conservative folks joining those school boards. Whether they can hold on to them, that's the big question, right? Because now they have bubbled up probably to the attention of statewide Democrats and national Democrats to say, look, this is a trend that we don't like, and they may be coming in here in the next, however many years to try and reclaim that territory.
It certainly sounds like we saw the results of the parents getting more involved, especially since the COVID days, and saying, wait a minute, what are our schools actually teaching? We've been watching it from behind our students on the computer screen, and I think they're a lot more involved now than they were.
I think so too.
No, I think that's exactly right. I think COVID in a lot of ways was the school choice moment for America because it forced parents to become more involved in what was going on, when they saw that they didn't like what was going on in their children's virtual classroom, they suddenly felt an agency to do something with it. And you see this, it's interesting, you see this with parents in other school choice programs. Talked with a mother several years ago who her daughter got a voucher in the Milwaukee public schools program in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, obviously. And she said that once she got that voucher, she suddenly felt this weight of this decision of, oh, now I have to make a decision about, I'm just not assigned and my daughter doesn't get whatever it is. Now I have to make a decision. Like now we are at home and now I have to make this decision about what my kid is going to learn. Am I going to enforce what the teacher says? Am I going to speak up and want my kid to be better educated than what I'm seeing right here in my own living room?
Unless there's anything else that we really ought to point out about the 2022 midterm elections, I'm going to throw you all a curveball.
Okay.
And as we wrap up, our next big cycle will be a very big cycle, another presidential election, 2024. As we're sitting here today, more than 2 years, I guess, or I guess less than 2 years now from that election, still almost 2 years. What's going to be the biggest thing you're going to be looking for in North Carolina in the 2024 cycle? Let's start with Donna.
Sure. So, of course, the election starts today. It may be 2 years away, but I think it was starting on November 9th for the most part.
At Carolina Journal.
Yep.
If it isn't up already, we'll have a story about a judicial candidate who's already saying that he's going
we had our first candidate, I think, declare just this weekend for Court of Appeals. So we're going to be talking a lot about that in the next 2 years. But I think I'm really going to, of course, be watching the governor's race. Governor Cooper is not going to be running for re-election. So folks are already gearing up, trying to figure out who's going to run for that. The Council of State races, they don't get as much attention, but this demonstrates, particularly when you look at the Treasurer Dale Folwell and some of the folks who are Catherine Truitt at DPI, the Attorney General, all of these Council of State races are critical to the proper functioning of our state. So I'll be really watching for those.
Yeah, and you mentioned that Governor Cooper can't run again, so that seat will be open. Lieutenant Governor Mark Robinson has been seen as a main candidate and contender for the governor's race. If that's true, that makes the lieutenant governor's seat open. Josh Stein, the attorney general, has been seen as a major candidate for governor. That would mean the attorney general's seat is open. Dale Folwell has been talking about potentially running for governor. That could make the treasurer's seat open. So there could be a lot of open Council of State races.
Absolutely.
There really could be, and that's really interesting because it's incredibly difficult to flip a Council of State seat in North Carolina. I think between 1976 and 2016 in North Carolina, 3 Council of State incumbents were defeated.
Really?
I mean, it's not much. It's incredibly difficult to unseat that because you don't know a lot about what they do. Everything's okay. The roads work. My car works. I pay some taxes, and so I'm assuming the state treasurer is doing his or her job, right? And so it's difficult to defeat an incumbent in that way. But you hinted at it, talking about Mark Robinson and Dale Folwell of, are there going to be 2 different primaries for governor for on the Democrat and Republican side? What do those look like? Or do Democrats sort of move things around like they did for Sherry Beasley in the U.S. Senate race this year and make sure that Josh Stein doesn't have a primary? I don't know, but there's going to be a lot of gamesmanship on both sides of the aisle over the next several months.
Sure.
And speaking of Josh Stein, one thing that will be interesting that will come out in the weeks and months ahead is what happens with this lawsuit that he is filing to try to get a campaign law thrown out against lying during campaigns about your opponent. That is something that goes to the 4th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals for oral arguments on December 6th. There had been some thought that because he wasn't officially charged by October of this year, that there would not be charges against him. But apparently, there has been a tolling agreement in that case so that if he ends up losing, the Wake County District Attorney's Office could charge him. Now it's a misdemeanor charge,
Right.
so it would not be anything major, but certainly it would be a stub of the toe as your campaign for governor is ramping up. So very interesting things are on the way. Any final thoughts before we wrap up this very interesting and enlightening discussion? Donald.
Well, my only announcement, it's not about the 2022 elections, but I do want to tell our audience this is the final Shaftesbury lecture of 2022. We'll come back again in January or February. We're sort of reconfiguring how we do Shaftesbury. We've done it the same way for a long time. We're very excited about some new programming we'll be bringing to all different parts of the state next year. And so go to johnlocke.org, take a look at our events page. We're going to have lots of events next year. And we look forward to coming out, not just in Raleigh and being here and coming to you virtually, but also coming out to different parts of the state and seeing you in person.
Absolutely. In Carolina Journal, we're going to be covering all of that. Plus, we're going to be looking forward to the North Carolina General Assembly coming back in January and starting a whole new session. It just starts all over again. It's going to be a big winter, I think.
And I guess I should mention that even though this is the last Shaftesbury, later this week, Donna and I will be back. Don Old will be busy out of state at the time, but Donna and I will be back with the latest Civitas poll presentation. So if you haven't signed up for that, please do. That'll be coming up on Thursday,
Right.
the same hour. We'll be talking about the latest information from the Civitas poll, which, as we discussed earlier in the hour, was incredibly accurate in our big U.S. Senate race and was very accurate on the other races as well. So you should pay attention to what the Civitas.
You absolutely should pay attention.
Yes.
That's right.
Donald Bryson is the President and Chief Strategy Officer for the John Locke Foundation. Donna King is Editor-in-Chief of Carolina Journal. My name is Mitch Kokai. I'm Senior Political Analyst at the Locke Foundation. And thank